This recording brought to you by the University of Adelaide.
It's good to see so many familiar and once familiar faces. It's a great day. You're a hard act to follow, Harry, but I've had a great time doing these interviews that Bruce persuaded me to do. When I started doing them, it quite quickly seemed to me that the period in the few years following the appointment of Professor Huxley was quite a remarkable period in the history of physics in Adelaide. And so then I chose people to interview with a focus on that period. What I want to do this morning is to try and talk to you about what might be called the Huxley Era, I suppose, because it begins with the appointment of Leonard Huxley and ends with Huxley's departure and finally the appointment of John Henry, I need to say, Carver. But best to start a story at the beginning, I think, and this is Horace Lamb, painted by his son, appointed by the University of Adelaide just 2 years after the university was founded. A Cambridge graduate, a mathematician, only 26 years old, appointed as Elder Professor of Mathematics. Came to Adelaide, taught natural philosophy as it was called then, stayed 9 years, returned to England to a distinguished career. There you can see Bragg, surrounded by the University of Adelaide Council in 1906. Bragg was another Cambridge graduate, 23 years old, a bachelor, a brilliant mathematician, was appointed to a chair which I think was called the Elder Chair of Mathematics and Experimental Physics. He stayed 22 years and returned to England to, as we all know, a most distinguished career. While he was here, his interests changed to experimental physics, and he fiddled around with radio transmission from West Terrace to Henley Beach, the medical imaging with X-rays, and then the absorption of ionising radiation in matter. He also was the first person to appoint a physics lecturer. In 1888 he appointed Robert Chapman, and Chapman later on became the first professor of engineering at this university and had a distinguished career. And then there was Kerr Grant. You can see Kerr Grant here in this picture and what I think was Kerr Grant's element. A group of students in an undergraduate laboratory. Kerr Grant was a Melbourne graduate, appointed Elder Professor of Physics, the first Professor of Physics in this university.
Alice, the other person standing at the back there with Kerr Grant is Angus's father.
Yes, I know. I was just going to tell you that. It's the person, there are two people there standing monitoring the class. And yes, the other one is Walter Hurst, who, yes, Angus's father. That's why I chose the photo, really, because Kerr Grant was a different person from his two predecessors. He was, Stan Tomlin wrote that he was not and would not have claimed to have been a brilliant physicist, but he was nevertheless a remarkable person. He wrote himself that he thought that research was subordinate to what he saw as the primary roles of the professor, and they were teaching and the public role of being the public expert for the community. He was a person of infectious enthusiasm, a great character. People still tell stories about him. And so the first 72 years of physics in Adelaide, in a large part, is the story of these three people. But there was much more to Kerr Grant's department than Kerr Grant, and I want to try and etch out a picture of what the department was like by the end of Kerr Grant's time. This is a list of the lecturing appointments in physics that Kerr Grant made. There were 11 of them. 4 of them, the ones in bold there, were appointments made at the end of the war. There was a scheme called the CRTS, Commonwealth Redevelopment and Training Scheme, where students where ex-servicemen returning from the war were assisted to obtain a university education. Harry was one of them. And those 4 appointments were made to cope with the influx of students at that time. A lot of those CRTS students, what were called the civilian enrolment, also increased, and the university enrolment doubled quite quickly. 5, I'm sorry, the ones in bold are not the 1946 ones. You can see the 1946 ones. The 5 in bold are the 5 who outlasted Kerr Grant, and so when Kerr Grant's successor came, that was the staff. Burden, Fuller, Iliff, Brooke and Aitchison. All of them were Adelaide graduates, and between them there were only 2 higher degrees. Roy Burden had a DSc from the University of Adelaide, and Gordon Aitchison had done a master's degree in the university on induction heating in 1945. I want to say a special thing about Roy Burden. It seems to me, after talking to the people I've talked to, that Roy Burden, in a real sense, was the hero of the Kerr Grant years. In this picture, Burden is circled there. The occasion of that picture is a bit later. It was taken in 1963. It was at a departmental Christmas party, I believe. You can see the Christmas tree in the background there. And you can see John Carver. You recognise Professor Sir Kerr Grant in the front there. You can see Mark Oliphant. You will recognise. You might also recognise on the left at the back George Fuller, Mick Iliff, and then there's Roy Burden. The occasion there was, I think, the retirement of George Fuller. George Fuller's wife here has been presented with flowers. George Fuller is holding a book that he was presented with, I think. But it's Roy Burden that I wanted to say a bit about. Over a very long period, from 1919, Roy Burden conducted research in surface tension. And it was a program of research that he carried on until at least 1951. And during that time, it was the only sustained research program in the physics department. There were many other projects, but they were all of an isolated nature. You get a project on this and then somebody else. There were master's projects. But it was Roy Burden who did a sustained program of research over that long period. He took it up at the suggestion of Kerr Grant after Kerr Grant had made a trip to the United States. But it was Roy Burden who did it, and his measurements of the surface tension of mercury were highly regarded. as the best values available. He wrote a monograph called The Surface Tension and the Spreading of Liquids, which went into a second edition. In 1927, he published 2 papers with a young Mark Oliphant. And Oliphant later wrote that he regarded this business of working with Roy Burden and the assistance he got from him as very important in getting the 1851 scholarship that took Oliphant to England and his subsequent career. Oliphant described Roy Burden as a remarkable man. He was a mentor of students. I found a newspaper cutting which describes how in 1949 he was given study leave to go to England to visit Adelaide graduates who were, as the newspaper put it, doing deep atomic research in England. Where he was going was Birmingham, where Oliphant then was, and a surprising collection of Adelaide graduates working with Oliphant there. This is a list of the MSc theses during Kerr Grant's time. It's quite a remarkable list, really. One remarkable thing about it is that before the Second World War, there had only been 2 master's degrees in physics awarded in this university. After the war, until Kerr Grant's retirement at the end of 1948, there were only 2 more. But during the war, there were 8. It was this remarkable burst of research activity. They're very diverse, and looking at the introductions to those theses, which are available online, we would now regard them as of highly variable quality, but some of them were quite remarkable. I just want to mention 2 of them. One was by John Cowley in 1945 on electron diffraction. He made some measurements of electron diffraction using a thing called the Finch camera. It was invented by a person called, a Professor Finch. Bob Crompton remembers this instrument quite well. He told me it was a vacuum apparatus which leaked badly because the mercury in the pumps had etched the solder. But it had been acquired by Burden, and it was the first significant electron-optical instrument installed in Australia. So Cowley put in this master's thesis. After that, he went to work for the CSIR. Then he had a chair in physics at the University of Melbourne. Then he went to a chair in physics at the Arizona State University in the United States. Had a long career there. There is there the John M. Cowley Centre for High Resolution Electron Microscopy, named in his honour. And he wrote a successful monograph called Diffraction Physics. A remarkable career from an Adelaide graduate. The other one I wanted to mention was John Cowley. John Cowley's thesis consists of 4 restricted access reports to the CSIR radiophysics laboratory in Sydney. And it was on a coaxial to waveguide transformer, which was all about radar technology at that time. He subsequently went to Birmingham to work with Oliphant on the design of the synchrotron that was being developed there. And then in 1948 he was appointed to the yet to be established Research School of Physical Sciences at the ANU. He was in fact the first academic appointment to that school. Oliphant's appointment as director was a few months after that, and he stayed in Birmingham with Oliphant working on plans for the school, and then in 1949 he became ill, was flown back to Adelaide and died. But that was a career cut short, but it was what was clearly heading as a distinguished career of another one of the master's graduates from Adelaide. And there were lots of others. John Simons also went to Birmingham, and there were quite a collection of Adelaide graduates there in Birmingham with Oliphant. This is an extract from the 1948 university calendar. Just the beginning of it shows Physics 1, you had to pay 5 guineas to go to the Physics 1 lectures in those days, and another 4 guineas to do the practical work. Students heading for an ordinary or pass or honours degree of BSc in physics were advised to buy the 5 volumes of Grimsale, textbook of physics. In those days, as had been the case for many years, Physics 1 was taught by Kerr Grant at 9 o'clock in the morning and repeated by George Fuller at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And it seems to me they complemented one another. People I've talked to comment that Kerr Grant's lectures were entertaining but uninformative. Fuller's lectures were systematic but I've forgotten the word now, but not entertaining. But it seemed to me that this had happened for a very long time, and there was a period during the war when the department, Kerr Grant had only Fuller and Roy Burden with him. They had a heavy teaching load. They taught Physics 1 for a long time. I rather suspect they used the same lecture notes for many years. And there was a stagnation of curriculum that occurred. I talked to Perry Miles, who did honours in 1949, and he commented about his lecturers saying that they were all good men, but they were the product of their time and background, and theirs was not modern physics. And so those people looking back see that the curriculum that they were given was lacked modern physics. In 1948, the honours class, there were no formal lectures for the honours class. They were asked to study certain chapters of Yost, theoretical physics, and they used to divide the chapters up between them and lecture to one another. In 1948, there was a master's degree candidate working in the department called Jim Boscher. He had come from the United Kingdom, he'd done his undergraduate years in the United Kingdom, and had done quantum mechanics courses there. And the class asked Jim to repeat the quantum mechanics course that he had done in England for them. And so the first course in quantum mechanics was a clandestine one. I'm assured that this was all arranged without Kerr Grant's knowledge. So at that time, the department was at a low ebb. The curriculum had fallen behind the progress of the discipline. There was not much research occurring. It seems to me that Kerr Grant had neither the resources nor the vision to build a modern teaching and research department. But the whole university was at a low ebb at that time. Hugh Stretton wrote that it was then Australia's worst funded university. The first development that occurred to change that situation was the appointment of a new Vice-Chancellor, A.P. Rowe. He was appointed in 1948, 1st of May, I seem to remember. He was the first full-time Vice-Chancellor at this university. He had an honours physics degree. He had headed the TRE, the Telecommunications Research Establishment during the war, and so led the development of radar. He was, seems to me, a provocative but proactive Vice-Chancellor. When he eventually went home to England, he wrote a book called If the Gown Fits. Harry knows it off by heart, I think. He's got a story in there about a fishing trawler captain who always seemed to bring back fish in after a long voyage fishing, brought back fish in better quality than all the other trawlers. And when he was asked why this was the case, he said, for every 1,000 herring we put in the tank, we put one catfish. The catfish eats a few, but it keeps the others alive. It seems to me that A.P. Rowe thought of himself as the catfish in the University of Adelaide. In the first 2 years, he doubled the university annual grant, persuaded Tom Playford, I think, the Premier of the time. He made 28 new academic appointments. During that year, 1948, one of the honours students was Graham Elford. Graham was interested in doing a PhD, but the PhD was not at that time offered by the University of Adelaide, and so Graham started to think in terms of perhaps going to the United Kingdom to do a postgraduate work. So he made an appointment to see the Vice-Chancellor, who had then only been in Adelaide for a few months, to ask his advice about where he might go to do a PhD. And the Vice-Chancellor told him that to stay put because there were plans afoot to introduce the PhD in Adelaide by the end of the year or early in the following year. So Graham was still reluctant because he was aware that there was not very much research happening in the physics department at Adelaide. And the Vice-Chancellor said to him, it'll be all right, there was a new professor coming and he is interested in several fields of research. The new professor was Leonard Huxley. Huxley was a Rhodes Scholar from Tasmania, worked under Townsend at Oxford. After he finished his DPhil, he worked for a short time with the Radio Research Board in Canberra, then became head of physics at Leicester. Wartime, he worked with A.P. Rowe's TRE on and ran a radar school there. Then he went to the University of Birmingham as reader in electromagnetism in the Department of Electrical Engineering. At that time, Mark Oliphant was in Birmingham, and it was Mark Oliphant who saw the advertisement, or knew of the advertisement of the Elder Chair in Adelaide, and said to Huxley, you should apply. So Huxley applied and was appointed. Bob Crompton clearly remembers, it's interesting this oral history business because you're really asking questions at the limits of people's memories, but Bob clearly remembers a day in January 1949 when he and a group of others who had done honours with him just the year before were standing around yarning in the department office, and a person they didn't know walked in dressed in a well-worn tweed sports coat and grey flannel trousers and a felt hat over bushy eyebrows. And he said, "I'm Huxley." And so that was the arrival of Leonard Huxley, who had come to lift a small department from the doldrums. And he had three advantages when he came, it seems to me. One was he had a supportive VC. The Vice-Chancellor was really keen to get things going. He had a setting up grant of £15,000, which must have been a fortune in those days, to re-equip the department. The Vice-Chancellor had persuaded the Council to set that aside. And he had some very bright honours students from the previous year. This is the honours class from 1948. You recognise some names there. Nine of them, the largest class ever. It was Kerr Grant's last honours class. There were 6 firsts awarded that year and 3 seconds. And it seems to me from a list that Graham Elford sent me that this was the first time ever that second class honours had been given in physics in Adelaide. But those people were, that class provided some very important people. Now, within quite a short time of Huxley's arrival, he called a meeting. He was anxious to get research going in the department, and he had ideas for research in 3 fields, and he was asking for volunteers to get those going. One was the diffusion of slow electrons in gases. He had been doing that in Birmingham, and he wanted to do it here. Bob Crompton and David Sutton said, "Yep, I'm interested in that. We're interested in that," and they took up that work. Huxley had brought with him, I'm trying to remember the words that Bob Crompton used, a pitiful bag of bits and pieces. And they included an electron drift apparatus, a stainless steel apparatus that a PhD student had built in Birmingham. Bob didn't want to use that. He said about building one of his own. And Bob very quickly especially became known for his experimental skills, glass blowing skills. And so that work put down roots quite quickly, and by February 1953 Bob and David had both submitted a PhD thesis, and they were the first PhD thesis in physics from this university. It seemed to be quite an achievement to do that in a department where there was no tradition of PhD level research, no models for how you write a thesis up. A second field was radio propagation in the ionosphere. Gordon Aitchison took that up, set about doing cross-modulation of 2 radio beams. He got a PhD in 1957. He was joined by Jeff Goodwin, who did a master's degree in that field. The third one was radar meteorastronomy that Graham Elford took up, and Graham's going to talk about that later, so I won't say much, except to say that by 1955 Graham and David Robinson, who had joined them, and Alan Weiss, who joined the group first as an honours student and then a PhD student, all had PhDs by 1955. So to be quite remarkable, those 3 fields were established. In 1949, I suppose they began, and there is a successor of them still, a direct successor of each of those fields still going. I found a document in the archives which was Huxley's teaching arrangements for 1950. And here are the first and second year it's quite clear that Huxley was, when he came, was very keen to modernise the curriculum. And I found letters that he had written to book publishers. He was examining potential textbooks within a few months. In June of the year he arrived, there was a letter in which he's returning a copy of Schiff's Quantum Mechanics, saying that he was pretty impressed by the book, but wasn't going to recommend it as a text, but he would get a copy for the library. Huxley threw himself into first-year teaching when he first came, because that's what his predecessor had done for many years, but he soon realised that his approach was too rigorous for the students to handle, and he then made different arrangements from then on, and he stuck to teaching electricity and magnetism. But what you see there is the old hands teaching Physics 1. In the second year, you see a couple of new names there. Huxley's teaching electricity, but the Sutton and Crompton there had done honours just 2 years before that. If we look at the third year teaching arrangements, you can see Crompton, Sutton, Ilford, recent honours graduates. Huxley with electricity and magnetism, Burden doing heat. Huxley using the resources that are available, and he obviously had a high regard for those honours graduates. A full program of honours lectures. These numbers are numbers of lectures. And so there are people there. There's a Rex Vowles who came from electrical engineering to give some lectures on Laplace transformations. But then there are the 1948 honours trio of Ilford, Sutton and Crompton. That was a mistake. Yes, they're there. And then there's another 5 names there. Thomas, Andrews, Stevenson, Miles and Colville, lecturing to honours, who were all honours students from the previous year. So this is 1950. In 1950, the Activities of Robe made available funds for the appointment of new lecturing staff. And he first of all appointed Bob Crompton and Graham Ilford in March 1950, 13th of March 1950. I've got a paper from the University Appointments Committee. Then at the end of the first term, I think it was, William Brooke, one of the older lecturers, resigned, and David Sutton was appointed in June to take his place. And then the following year, Harry Medlin was appointed to what he assures me was a lectureship in biophysics. Harry, I don't know whether Harry's writing his memoirs at all, but interesting story of which Bruce summarised a bit. Perhaps I'll come to that just in a moment. But what you can see is the department's now very different. It's got young, new staff, reinvigorated curriculum, and research programs rapidly taking root. The next that happened was there were 2 landmark appointments, it seems to me, were the next step in the development of physics in Adelaide. The first of these was Stan Tomlin. Here's a photo taken in the old, what they call the old tea room in the department. Stan Tomlin is here. You might recognise David Sutton and Bob Crompton. And this person over here is, I'm told, Claire Sykes, who was Huxley's secretary at the time. Tomlin had won a scholarship to go to King's College, did honours in 1937, studied a PhD on magnetic lenses to focus beta particles. The war interrupted. He was drafted into STC, Standard Telephones and Cables, where he worked on the klystron as an amplifier for radar receivers. Finished his PhD in his spare time, was awarded in 1945, and then at the end of the war he went back to King's College as a lecturer in physics and took up research in biophysics using an electron microscope to study cell membranes. A position at Adelaide was advertised and Stan applied, motivated by his daughter's health. He had a daughter who suffered from a respiratory disease, and he thought the climate in Adelaide would help her. He was appointed, he arrived in May 1950. He set up a laboratory, a biophysics laboratory in the department. The two lines of research quickly emerged. One was in electron microscopy, because he had negotiated as a setting up grant the purchase of a Philips electron microscope, which when it arrived in 1952 was the third large electron microscope to be installed in this country. Stan Tomlin became part of a national committee for electron microscopy, and so that work started. I think the first student to work with that was Barbara Kidman Potts and Buckets, who is here this morning. The other line of work was X-ray crystallography. Now, according to my notions, the first student to enrol for a PhD in Stan Tomlin's lab was a fellow called Roy Worthington. But the fellow who really got it started was Harry. Because Harry had set up an X-ray tube as an honours project in, must have been 1950, was it, Harry? And then went on to PhD work. By January 1953, there were four postgraduate students working in Stan's lab. There were Roy Worthington, Harry, Murray Andrews, who withdrew before finishing his degree, and Barbara Potts, Kidman and Buckets. Huxley had 6 students at that time. I'd like to say that Barbara Potts was the first woman to do honours physics in Adelaide, and she and Barbara Hall Pottingham and Buckets were the first women PhDs from this university. Tomlin was astonished by the curriculum at Adelaide when he arrived, the lack of things like quantum mechanics and relativity, and he took a leading part in modernising the curriculum. Topics such as is attributed with the first sophisticated courses in thermal physics, statistical mechanics, quantum mechanics, and solid-state physics. Now, the next remarkable appointment was the appointment of Bert Green. I won't say too much about the mathematical physicists because Peter Zekaris is talking later on, but I do want to say a few things. Bert Green had done a PhD in DSC in Scotland. Edinburgh, in Scotland. Yes, I forgot it here. It was a brilliant appointment for Adelaide. And the natural question is, why he had been offered positions in the United States, for example. Why did he come to Adelaide? And it seems from I talked to Angus Hurst, that Bert had this independence of mind. He wanted the freedom to pursue his ideas, and he felt he couldn't do that in the midst of American science. And so Adelaide was quite attractive to him. Angus tells a story of how Bert, trying to illustrate what Angus regarded Bert as a genius. And he told the story of how one weekend Bert, time was hanging on his hands a bit, and he filled in time by writing a paper on a new theory of the generalised statistics of particles. And that was published. It's 3.5 pages, which to an experimental physicist seems very concise. It was the beginning of the new field of parastatistics, and is still the most cited of Bert's publications. In those days, a new chair meant a new department. And so there had to be a new department of mathematical physics, which was located in the physics building. And it seems that, I can imagine there was a lot of discussion about where this thing should go, but it seems that the triangle, which was mathematical physics, physics and mathematics, that the relationships on the sides were best optimised if you put mathematical physics in the physics building. The mathematical physics always had the feeling of a small research institute based around the brilliance of Bert Green. It never rose to more than 4 people, but became what I would think could be described as a jewel in the crown of the university. There was another appointment to go with the chair. Harry Messel was appointed. He only stayed 9 months. John Ward was appointed. He only stayed 9 months. And then Angus Hirst was appointed. And Angus, as you know, had a long career and became a very important part of physics in Adelaide. I just want to say about Angus that he went to Cambridge following his father, Walter, who had been the first South Australian to graduate from Cambridge. And one of the things that Angus said that he learnt at Cambridge was that it is okay to tackle the hard problems, as you put it. What he meant was, he realised it was all for him to work on the most fundamental things. And that was an attitude that he instilled in his students always afterwards. He said in an interview with Bob Crompton later about his work, reflecting back on his work, he said, "It is not new particles and it's not new laws of physics, but it puts things on a solid foundation, and I'm very proud of that." Angus quickly developed a reputation for intellectual prowess and uncompromisingly challenging lectures and exams. Well remember students shaking their heads coming out of a Angus Hirst exam thinking they'd failed. I was impressed when I read that during the war Angus went into the Air Force and trained to operate radar stations and commanded radar stations. But during his training he built an oscilloscope, became an expert in soldering. I thought, he's a real person after all. The pairing of Angus Hirst and Bert Green became a very important combination. Angus, again in that interview with Bob Crompton, told a story about how they'd collaborated on work on the icing model. But Angus's description of the collaboration was this. Angus, had an idea that might be pursued in developing a solution to the icing model, and I told it to Bert. Bert said, "That's interesting," and went away. And then a few days later he came back with a finished paper. I'm running out of time, aren't I? I've run out of time. Let me just whiz through. mathematical physics gradually became a teaching department. There's a fascinating story about seismology, how David Sutton became involved in seismology. I've written about that in that paper, so you can read it. I do want to say, but then Huxley resigned, went first to CSIRO and then to ANU as Vice-Chancellor. There was an interim period when Tomlin was appointed acting head of department. I did want to say that Tomlin is clear dearly wanted to be appointed to the Elder Chair, and he began solid state work to strengthen his application and was profoundly disappointed when he was not appointed. The new appointee was John Henry Carver, and who was a nuclear physicist at ANU, where Oliphant now was, and it was Oliphant who brought the advertisement to John Carver's attention. So for a second successive time, Oliphant had been influential in the Elder Chair appointment, and that seems to be a good place to stop. Thank you.